Pick up a shovel almost anywhere in the world and dig down about 10 to 15 feet. Go ahead, try it in San Francisco, in London, in Moscow, in Istanbul. What you'll find will stop you cold. Buildings, streets, entire ground floors of structures that were clearly built to be entered from what's now buried deep underground. Windows that now sit below your feet. Doorways that open into packed earth. First floors that have somehow become basements, and above it all, covering everything like a brown blanket. Mud. Lots and lots of mud. This isn't some isolated mystery. It's everywhere. In Seattle, 19th century storefronts sit buried beneath the modern sidewalk, accessible now only through underground tours. In Rome, ancient streets rest 30 feet below the current city level. In Samarkand, medieval buildings poke out of the ground like half-submerged ships. The official explanation: gradual accumulation over centuries, dust, debris, the slow build-up of human habitation. But here's the thing that keeps people up at night. The mud came fast, too fast. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is right now. I check them all, and it's wild. Tokyo at dawn, Toronto at midnight, all these different moments happening at once. All of us thinking about the same mysteries. There's a pattern emerging that archaeologists don't like to talk about. Cities across the world show the same strange signature. A layer of mud, sometimes mixed with sand or clay, sitting between historical periods like someone hit the pause button on civilization. Buildings that were clearly occupied one day, and then suddenly filled with sediment. Not gradually, not over centuries, but rapidly enough that people left everything behind. Furniture, tools, personal items, all preserved in the mud like some kind of geological time capsule. You know that feeling when you notice something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. That's what researchers felt for decades looking at these sites. In St. Petersburg, Baroque palaces have their ground floors buried under 15 feet of earth. In Chicago, entire streets were razed in the 1850s because the original city sat too low, partially buried already. The conventional explanation involves flooding, poor drainage, intentional fill. But talk to the engineers who study these sites. The math doesn't quite work. There's too much mud in too many places deposited too consistently. And then there are the myths. Every single culture on Earth, every civilization we have records from, tells the same basic story. The world was destroyed by water. A great flood came and reset everything, wiped the slate clean, started humanity over from scratch. The Sumerians told it, the Babylonians told it, the Greeks, the Norse, the Hindus, the Chinese, the Mayans, the Aboriginal Australians, the Native Americans from dozens of different tribes who never had contact with each other. All of them independently recorded stories of a catastrophic flood that buried the old world and forced survivors to rebuild from nothing. Now you might think, okay, ancient people lived near rivers. Floods happened. They made up stories to explain natural disasters. Standard mythology stuff. But these aren't just flood stories. They're reset stories. They describe entire civilizations being wiped out, technologies lost, knowledge destroyed, survivors emerging into a world covered in mud and having to start over, having to relearn everything. The biblical flood lasted 40 days and nights. The Sumerian version, older by at least 1,000 years, lasted 6 days and 7 nights. The Hindu text describes cycles of destruction and renewal, worlds ending in water and fire over and over again. The Hopi speak of multiple worlds that came before this one, each destroyed when humanity forgot the old ways. Different details, different gods, different timelines. But the same core memory. The mud came and swallowed history. Here's where it gets interesting. What if these weren't just myths? What if scattered across the world, buried under our cities, preserved in oral traditions so old they predate writing itself, there's actual evidence of something catastrophic, something that deposited enormous amounts of sediment across vast regions in a relatively short time period, something that forced whoever survived to literally dig themselves out and start civilization over. This is the ancient reset hypothesis. The idea that human history isn't a straight line of progress, but a cycle of rise and fall, building and burying, advancement and catastrophe. That we've been here before, built before, maybe even thrived before, only to have it all covered over by mud and forgotten. Tonight we're going to dig into this mystery. We'll explore the cities found beneath our feet, examine the flood myths that span every culture, look at what science actually says about catastrophic mud deposits, and ask the uncomfortable question nobody wants to answer. If it happened before, could it happen again? So settle in, get comfortable. Let's go deep into the mud that swallowed history. Walk down almost any old street in almost any old city, and you might notice something strange. The ground floor of that beautiful 19th century building isn't actually at ground level anymore. There are steps leading down to what were clearly supposed to be first floor windows. Or maybe you'll see a door that's half buried. The top of the door frame now sitting at sidewalk level, the bottom disappearing into the earth. If you're paying attention, if you really look at the architecture around you, you'll start seeing this pattern everywhere. Buildings that have been swallowed by the ground itself. This is where the mud flood mystery begins. Not with ancient myths or catastrophic theories, but with a simple, observable fact. Cities around the world are sitting on top of older versions of themselves, and the question that haunts researchers who notice this pattern is deceptively simple. How did so much earth accumulate so quickly in so many places? Let's start with the most dramatic examples, because there's no point being subtle about this. In San Francisco, during construction projects throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, workers kept finding something unexpected. Ships, not small boats or fishing vessels, but massive sailing ships, buried beneath city streets, sometimes 20 or 30 feet below the current surface level. These weren't shipwrecks that had sunk in the harbour and been covered gradually over centuries. These were functioning ships that had been abandoned during the gold rush, deliberately filled with sand and debris, and then somehow ended up deep underground in what seemed like an impossibly short time. The conventional explanation is straightforward. During the 1850s, as San Francisco exploded from a sleepy settlement into a booming city, developers were desperate for usable land. The harbour was full of ships abandoned by crews who had fled to the goldfields. So the developers did what seemed practical at the time. They filled in the ships, covered them with earth and construction debris, and built on top of them. Over the next few decades, more fill was added to expand the city into the bay. Streets were raised, buildings were constructed on top of the fill, and gradually, layer by layer, those ships were buried deeper and deeper. That makes sense, right? Deliberate human engineering explains everything, except for one nagging detail. The ships aren't buried under 50 or 100 years' worth of gradual accumulation. They're buried under layers that seem to have appeared much more rapidly than conventional development patterns would suggest. Construction projects that broke ground in the 1870s, just 20 years after the ships were abandoned, were already finding them buried under 10 or 15 feet of compacted earth. That's a lot of material to accumulate in 2 decades, even in a rapidly developing city. But San Francisco isn't unique. Travel north to Seattle, and you'll find something even more bizarre. An entire underground city. Not ancient ruins from some lost civilization, but 19th century storefronts, sidewalks and streets, all buried beneath the modern city. You can take tours of this subterranean world, walking through passageways that used to be above ground, looking up at what were once first-floor windows, now suspended in darkness beneath Seattle's current street level. The official story is well documented. In 1889, a massive fire destroyed much of Seattle's downtown. The city decided to rebuild at a higher elevation to solve persistent flooding problems. As new buildings went up, the streets were gradually raised, sometimes by as much as 22 feet. For years, the city existed at 2 levels, simultaneously. New sidewalks and streets at the higher elevation, old storefronts and businesses at the original level. Eventually, the lower level was abandoned and buried completely, creating the underground city that tourists visit today. Again, perfectly logical. Deliberate urban planning explains the buried city, except that the amount of fill material required to raise entire neighborhoods by 20 feet is staggering. Where did it all come from? The regrading projects moved earth from nearby hills, but the sheer volume involved, accomplished in just a few decades of the late 1800s, represents an engineering effort that seems almost implausible for the technology and labor force available at the time. And here's where the mystery deepens. Because Seattle and San Francisco aren't isolated cases. This pattern of buried lower levels appears in cities across the globe, often with remarkably similar characteristics. Walk through the old parts of London, and you'll find Georgian and Victorian buildings with basement windows that sit at street level, suggesting the ground floor was once higher. The city has an entire system of underground rivers and tunnels built at what was clearly a different elevation than the current surface. In Paris, construction of the metro system revealed layers of earlier cities beneath the modern streets. Not medieval ruins, though those exist too, but relatively recent buildings from the 18th and 19th centuries, partially buried and forgotten. Rome, built famously on 7 hills, has multiple layers of history stacked on top of each other. But even the relatively recent layers, structures from just a few hundred years ago, are often found several feet below current street level. Cross the Atlantic to North America, and the pattern continues. In Charleston, South Carolina, historic buildings have basement windows at ground level. In Galveston, Texas, the entire city was razed after a devastating flood, but the amount of fill required and the speed of the work seemed disproportionate to the engineering capabilities of the early 1900s. In Boston, the Back Bay neighborhood was built on filled marshland, and like San Francisco, workers kept finding evidence of the old surface much deeper than expected. What's particularly striking is the consistency. In city after city, across continents and cultures that had no direct connection during the 19th century, you find buried first floors at depths that cluster around similar ranges, 8 to 12 feet in many cases, sometimes more. It's as if something caused a global rise in ground level during a relatively narrow window of time. Now, before we dive too deep into alternative theories, let's acknowledge the mainstream explanation, because it's important and it's mostly correct. Cities have been burying their pasts since cities existed. It's not mysterious at all. When buildings burn down or collapse, the debris doesn't get carted away completely. It gets spread around, compacted, built on top of. Streets get paved over existing surfaces, raising the level incrementally. Flooding deposits sediment, Wind brings dust and dirt that accumulates over decades and centuries. This process, called urban stratification, is well understood by archaeologists. Ancient cities like Troy have multiple distinct layers representing different periods of habitation, each built on the ruins of what came before. The same thing happens in modern cities, just faster because of the pace of development and the volume of construction debris generated. Add to this deliberate regrading projects. During the 19th century, many cities undertook massive engineering efforts to improve sanitation, reduce flooding, and create more usable land. These projects involved moving truly staggering amounts of earth. Seattle's regrading is well documented, but it wasn't unique. San Francisco, Boston, Chicago, and numerous other cities conducted similar work. In each case, hills were leveled, valleys were filled, and street levels were raised, sometimes dramatically. So the conventional explanation is clear. Urban development, fire debris, deliberate regrading, and the natural accumulation of sediment over time account for buried lower levels. Mystery solved, right? Except that some researchers who have looked carefully at the timeline and the physical evidence aren't entirely satisfied. First, there's the question of speed. Yes, cities can raise their streets and bury old structures, but the conventional explanation requires enormous amounts of fill material to have been moved in relatively short periods. Seattle's regrading moved millions of cubic yards of earth, but it took decades and was one of the largest such projects in American history. Yet smaller cities without documented regrading projects of similar scale show similar patterns of buried first floors. Where did their fill come from? Second, there's the consistency problem. If burial was purely the result of local development and natural accumulation, you'd expect significant variation between cities based on their specific histories. A city that experienced a major fire might have more debris accumulation. A city built on a floodplain might have more sediment deposits. A city with aggressive development might have more construction fill. Yet the depths of burial often cluster around similar ranges regardless of these local factors. Buildings in London, Paris, Moscow, Boston, and San Francisco are buried to surprisingly similar depths, even though their development histories were quite different. Third, and this is where it gets really interesting, there's the sediment itself. In many cases, the material burying the lower levels isn't just construction debris or broken bricks, it's mud. Fine-grained sediment that looks more like it was deposited by water than accumulated through urban development. Some buildings show distinct layers, almost like geological strata, suggesting periodic episodes of rapid deposition rather than gradual accumulation. This is what led some researchers to propose the mudflood hypothesis. The idea is deceptively simple. What if, during the 19th century, something happened that caused rapid accumulation of sediment in cities around the world? Not a gradual process over centuries, but a relatively sudden event or series of events that buried lower levels quickly enough that was easier to build on top than to excavate. Now, mainstream historians and geologists have strong objections to this theory, and we need to take them seriously. There's no evidence in historical records of a global mudflood during the 1800s. We have extensive documentation from this period. Newspapers, government records, personal letters and diaries. A catastrophic mudflood that buried cities would have been noticed and recorded. Yet the historical record shows only localized floods, fires, and the deliberate regrading projects that conventional explanation relies on. Moreover, geological evidence doesn't support a sudden global depositional event. Core samples from cities show gradual accumulation consistent with normal urban development, not the signature of catastrophic flooding. The sediment layers can be dated using various techniques, and they consistently show accumulation over decades and centuries, not sudden deposition. But here's what keeps the mystery alive: the disconnect between what the physical evidence seems to show and what the historical record documents. Walk through old city centres, and the buried buildings look like they were swallowed by the earth suddenly and completely. They don't look like they were gradually covered over generations. The architectural details, the careful stonework, the ornate entrances, they're all still there, just underground, as if the builders never anticipated they'd be buried at all. And then there are the anomalies. Buildings where the burial seems to predate any documented regrading or development. Structures where the amount of fill required exceeds what local records suggest was available. Cities where residents in the 19th century themselves noted and remarked on the strange phenomenon of sinking buildings as if the earth was rising around them rather than the structures settling into it. Perhaps most intriguingly, there are the connections to those ancient flood myths we talked about in the previous section. Many cultures have legends not just of one great flood, but of periodic resets, times when the earth was covered with mud and civilization had to rebuild. Native American traditions speak of mud covering the old world. Asian legends describe epochs ending in burial and rebirth. European folklore contains stories of cities swallowed by the earth, only to be rediscovered centuries later. Could these be cultural memories of actual events? Not a single global catastrophe, but a pattern of localized mudflows, floods, and rapid sedimentation that affected different regions at different times throughout history? Events significant enough to leave physical traces but localized enough that no single global record captured them all? The mainstream view is that we're seeing pattern recognition where none exists. Humans are excellent at finding connections, even when they're coincidental. Cities bury their pasts. That's what cities do. The fact that they do it in similar ways is just a reflection of similar urban development processes, not evidence of a coordinated global phenomenon. But walk down those half-buried streets. Look at those basement windows at sidewalk level. Stand in Seattle's underground city and imagine it bustling with life at what was then ground level. The physical evidence is undeniable. Something buried these spaces. The question is whether that something was the slow, understandable process of urban development and deliberate engineering, or whether there's something else, something faster and stranger, hidden in the layers of mud beneath our feet. Because here's the thing that keeps researchers digging, both literally and figuratively. We know cities buried themselves. The question is whether they buried themselves quickly enough, comprehensively enough, and consistently enough to account for what we see today, or whether the physical evidence hints at processes we don't fully understand, events that happened too fast or too recently to fit comfortably into our understanding of urban history. The mud is still there, compacted beneath the streets of 100 cities, and buried in that mud might be not just old buildings, but old mysteries. Questions about how quickly landscapes can change, how thoroughly history can be covered over, and whether the ground beneath our feet is as stable and predictable as we'd like to believe. Here's where things get really interesting. Because while archaeologists are digging up buried cities and geologists are arguing about mud deposits, there's another kind of evidence that's been sitting in plain sight for thousands of years. Stories. Not just any stories. Flood stories. Reset stories. Tales of a world that ended in water and mud. Of civilizations that were swallowed whole. Of humanity being forced to start over from scratch. And here's the thing that should make you sit up and pay attention. These stories are everywhere, not just in one culture or one region, but across every inhabited continent. Cultures that had no contact with each other for thousands of years somehow all remember the same basic event. A catastrophic flood that destroyed the world. Let's start in Mesopotamia, in what's now Iraq, where human civilization supposedly began. Around 2100 BCE, Sumerian scribes were pressing cuneiform characters into wet clay tablets, recording a story that was already ancient by their standards, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Most people know Gilgamesh as the warrior king searching for immortality, but buried in that epic is a flood story that makes the biblical version look like a brief summary. In the Mesopotamian account, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood, not because humans are particularly evil, but because they're too noisy. They're keeping the gods awake. Think about that for a second. The divine justification for wiping out civilization is basically a noise complaint, but one god, Ea, decides to save a man named Utnapishtim. He whispers a warning through the reed walls of Utnapishtim's house, tells him to build a boat. Not just any boat. The specifications are incredibly detailed. A cube-shaped vessel, 7 stories tall, divided into 9 compartments, sealed with bitumen inside and out. Utnapishtim loads the boat with his family, craftsmen from his city, and breeding pairs of every animal. Then the flood comes, and the description is terrifying. The gods themselves are frightened by what they've unleashed. Even the divine beings huddle together like frightened dogs as the waters rise. For 6 days and 7 nights the flood rages. When it finally subsides, Utnapishtim's boat comes to rest on Mount Nimush. He sends out birds to test whether the waters have receded. First a dove, which returns, then a swallow, which also returns. Finally a raven, which doesn't come back, indicating that dry land has appeared. The gods smell Utnapishtim's sacrifice and gather around it like flies, starving because there's been no one to offer them food while humanity would drown. The goddess Ishtar holds up her lapis lazuli necklace and swears she will never forget this terrible day. Now, this story was old when the Gilgamesh scribes recorded it. Archaeological evidence suggests the flood narrative was already ancient Sumerian tradition by 2100 BCE, which means the events it describes, if based on real catastrophes, could have happened thousands of years earlier. But here's what makes it fascinating. The details. This isn't vague mythology, it's specific. Measurements, timelines, construction techniques. It reads less like myth and more like an engineering report wrapped in religious language. Someone remembered details. Someone thought those details were important enough to preserve for thousands of years. Now let's jump to the Hebrew Bible, written down much later but preserving traditions that may be equally ancient. Everyone knows the Noah's Ark story, but most people don't realize just how specific it gets. Genesis doesn't just say God sent a flood, it gives you construction specs. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. That's roughly 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. Massive, but according to modern naval engineering, entirely seaworthy. 3 decks, rooms, a window, a door in the side, coated inside and out with pitch to make it waterproof. Noah gets 7 days warning. He loads up his family and the animals. Then the floodgates of heaven open, and the fountains of the deep burst forth. That phrase, fountains of the deep, has always been fascinating. It doesn't just describe rain. It describes water coming from below, from the earth itself, like something geological, not just meteorological. The flood lasts 40 days and 40 nights of rain, but the waters don't recede for 150 days. When they finally do, the ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Noah sends out birds, first a raven, then a dove 3 times. The dove returns with an olive branch, indicating plant life has started growing again. Finally, Noah and his family emerge to restart civilization. God promises never to flood the earth again and sets the rainbow in the sky as a covenant sign. The similarities to the Mesopotamian account are obvious, too obvious to be coincidence. Either one culture borrowed from the other, which is possible since the Hebrews were exiled to Babylon, or both are preserving memories of the same real event, modified through thousands of years of retelling. But here's where it gets wild. These aren't the only flood stories, not even close. Let's go to India. The Hindu texts preserve their own version in the Matsya Purana and the Satapatha Brahmana. A man named Manu is washing his hands in a river when a tiny fish appears and begs him for protection. Manu takes the fish home and cares for it as it grows. Eventually the fish becomes enormous and reveals itself as Matsya, an avatar of the god Vishnu. Matsya warns Manu that a great flood is coming that will destroy all life on earth. He tells Manu to build a boat and stock it with seeds of every plant and breeding pairs of every animal. When the flood comes, Matsya appears as a giant horned fish. Manu ties his boat to Matsya's horn, and the fish tows them through the raging waters until they reach the highest mountain peak. There, Manu waits for the waters to recede. When they do, he performs a sacrifice and eventually repopulates the earth. The text specifically says Manu becomes the progenitor of the new human race. Everyone alive today is descended from this flood survivor. Notice the pattern? Divine warning, chosen survivor, detailed preparation, complete destruction, new beginning, different culture, same basic narrative structure. Now let's head to ancient Greece. The Greeks had their own flood story featuring Deucalion, son of Prometheus. Zeus decides that the Bronze Age of humanity has become too violent and corrupt. He's going to reset everything. But Prometheus warns his son, build a chest, stock it with food, seal yourself and your wife Pyrrha inside. For 9 days and 9 nights, Zeus floods the world. All of humanity drowns, all the cities are submerged. When the waters finally recede, Deucalion's chest comes to rest on Mount Parnassus. He and Pyrrha emerge as the only survivors. They make a sacrifice to Zeus, who tells them through an oracle to throw the bones of their mother behind them. They figure out this means stones from the earth. As they throw stones over their shoulders, the rocks transform into people. The stones Deucalion throws become men. The stones Pyrrha throws become women. Humanity is literally rebuilt from the earth itself. Different continent, different god, same story structure. But wait, there's more. Cross the Pacific to the Americas, where indigenous cultures had been developing in complete isolation from Eurasia for at least 15,000 years. No contact, no cultural exchange, and yet they have flood stories too. The Hopi people of the American Southwest describe multiple worlds that humanity has inhabited. Each world ends in catastrophe when humans become corrupt. The first world ended in fire. The second world froze. But the third world ended in flood. According to Hopi tradition, the people who still followed the spiritual path were warned. They went inside hollow reeds and sealed themselves in as the waters rose. They floated on the flood for a long time before the waters receded, and they could emerge to populate the fourth world, the one we live in now, move south to the Aztecs. Their mythology describes multiple ages of creation, each ending in catastrophe. The fourth sun, as they called it, ended when the sky goddess sent so much rain that the world flooded. The sky itself fell. All of humanity drowned except for one man and one woman who hid inside a hollow log. When the waters receded, they emerged, but they had to repopulate the earth and reinvent civilization from nothing. Further south, the Inca preserved stories of a great flood sent by the creator god Viracocha to punish humanity. Only one man and one woman survived by climbing to the top of the highest mountain. From them, all the peoples of the Andes descended. 3 different American civilizations separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years. No contact with each other, and certainly no contact with Mesopotamia, India, or Greece. Yet they all remember the same event: a world-destroying flood, divine punishment, a handful of survivors, a reset. Now, let's go to China. Chinese mythology preserves what might be the most detailed flood account outside of Mesopotamia. During the reign of Emperor Yao, traditionally dated to around 2300 BCE, a catastrophic flood devastated the land. The waters rose so high they threatened heaven itself. They destroyed crops, submerged cities, and killed countless people. Emperor Yao appointed a man named Gun to control the flood. Gun tried for 9 years, building dams and dikes, but the waters kept rising. He failed completely. Finally, Gun's son Yu took over. Yu didn't just try to contain the flood. He dredged channels and created waterways to drain the excess water. For 13 years, Yu worked tirelessly, traveling throughout China, organizing massive labor projects, creating the hydraulic infrastructure that would allow civilization to survive. He was so dedicated that he passed his own house 3 times during those 13 years and never went in, not even to see his newborn son. Eventually Yu succeeded. The waters receded, the land became habitable again, and Yu became emperor, founding the Xia dynasty, China's first historical dynasty. What's fascinating about the Chinese account is that it's less mythological than the others. There's no divine warning, no boat full of animals. Instead, it reads like a historical account of a real disaster and the engineering solution that solved it. Chinese scholars have debated for centuries whether Yu was a real person or a mythological figure. But the flood he fought, that's described as absolutely real. And archaeological evidence suggests there may have been a massive flood event in the Yellow River Valley around 1900 BCE, slightly later than the traditional date but close enough to suggest the mythology preserves real memories. But perhaps the most intriguing flood traditions come from Australia. Aboriginal Australians have lived on their continent for at least 65,000 years, making them the oldest continuous culture on Earth. They had 0 contact with the outside world until Europeans arrived, 0 opportunity to borrow flood myths from anyone else. And yet, Aboriginal Dreamtime stories are full of floods. Multiple Aboriginal groups from different parts of the continent preserve stories of catastrophic water events that reshaped the landscape. The Gunai people of southeast Australia tell of a time when the sea level rose and flooded vast areas. People fled to the mountains carrying fire. Those who didn't reach high ground drowned. In northwest Australia, Aboriginal groups describe how the land that once connected the mainland to offshore islands was submerged, forcing people to learn to cross water. The Narunga people of South Australia preserve stories of Spencer Gulf filling with water, submerging hunting grounds and campsites. These aren't vague myths. They include specific geographic details about which areas flooded and where people took refuge. What makes these stories remarkable is that they may be the oldest flood narratives on Earth. Because we know from geological evidence that sea levels did rise dramatically around Australia at the end of the last ice age, roughly 10,000 to 7,000 years ago. Aboriginal oral traditions may be preserving actual memories of these events, passed down through 400 generations. That's not mythology, that's history transmitted through story. So let's step back and look at the pattern. From Mesopotamia to China, from Greece to Peru, from India to Australia, human cultures preserve stories of catastrophic floods. The details vary. Sometimes it's divine punishment, sometimes it's natural disaster. Sometimes everyone dies except one family. Sometimes small groups survive on mountain tops or in boats. But certain elements appear again and again. Water rising to cover the earth, cities and civilizations destroyed, a handful of survivors, knowledge and culture lost, humanity forced to rebuild from almost nothing. Skeptics say this proves nothing. Of course, ancient cultures have flood stories. Everyone lives near water. Rivers flood. Coastlines change. Tsunamis happen. People create myths to explain natural events they don't understand. And sure, that explains some of it, but does it explain the specificity? Does it explain why cultures on opposite sides of the planet, with no possible contact for tens of thousands of years, all describe the same basic sequence? Warning, catastrophe, survival, reset? Does it explain why so many of these stories include details that sound less like primitive mythology and more like eyewitness accounts? The measurements in Gilgamesh, the timeline in Genesis, the geographic specifics in Aboriginal traditions, the engineering details in the Chinese accounts. Here's another way to think about it. These stories all describe a reset, not just a natural disaster, but a fundamental disruption of civilization itself, a moment when the old world ended and survivors had to build a new one from scratch. They describe losing knowledge, losing technology, losing entire ways of life. They describe the trauma of watching everything familiar disappear beneath mud and water. And they describe the desperate struggle to preserve something, anything, for whatever comes next, whether it's seeds and animals on a boat, or knowledge passed down through stories, or survivors clinging to mountain tops waiting for the waters to recede. What if these aren't primitive attempts to explain localized flooding? What if they're humanity's collective memory of something much bigger? Some event or series of events so catastrophic that every surviving culture remembered and retold the story, modifying details through thousands of years but preserving the core narrative. A reset, a moment when the world as humans knew it ended and a new world had to be built from the ruins. The question isn't whether ancient people experienced floods. They obviously did. The question is whether they experienced something big enough, traumatic enough, civilization-ending enough to embed itself in the collective memory of our entire species. Something that would justify preserving these stories for hundreds of generations. Something that would make people in Mesopotamia, India, China, Greece, Peru, and Australia all decide the same narrative was important enough to remember forever. Because if that's what these stories are, if they're not mythology but memory, then we need to take them seriously. Not as literal accounts, obviously. Details get distorted over thousands of years, but as evidence that something happened, something that reset human civilization, something that buried the old world in mud and water and forced survivors to start over. And if it happened before, the uncomfortable question becomes, could it happen again? But before we go there, we need to look at what the actual physical evidence tells us, because ancient stories are compelling, but science deals in facts. So what do geology, archaeology and climate science say about these universal flood myths? That's where things get really complicated. So here's where we stop dealing in myths and legends and start asking the hard question. Did something actually happen? Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but physically, geologically, catastrophically. Did the Earth experience some kind of reset event that could explain all these flood stories, all these tales of mud-swallowing civilizations, all these memories of the world ending and beginning again? The answer is yes, but it's complicated, because what really happened wasn't one event. It was a cascade of catastrophes, a series of planetary-scale disasters that unfolded over thousands of years at the end of the last ice age. And the evidence isn't buried in ancient texts or hidden in conspiracy theories. It's written in ice cores, sediment layers, and the actual landscape of the planet itself. Let's start with the big one. 12,800 years ago, something hit us. Not metaphorically, literally. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that around 10,800 BCE, a comet or asteroid fragment exploded over North America with a force that would make modern nuclear arsenals look like fireworks. The evidence is controversial, hotly debated, and absolutely fascinating. Here's what we know for certain. 12,800 years ago, Earth's climate was warming. The ice age that had gripped the planet for over 100,000 years was ending. Ice sheets that had covered Canada and northern Europe for millennia were melting. Sea levels were rising. Then suddenly, catastrophically, the warming stopped. Temperatures plunged. In less than a decade, maybe in as little as 3 years, the climate reversed. The planet went from rapidly warming to ice age conditions. This event, called the Younger Dryas, lasted 1,200 years. For over a century, geologists assumed this was just climate being weird. Maybe ocean currents shifted. Maybe ice melt disrupted heat distribution. Natural cycles, nothing unusual. Then in 2007, a team of researchers proposed something radical. What if it wasn't natural at all? What if something hit us? The evidence they found is buried in a thin layer of sediment that dates to exactly 12,800 years ago. This layer, found at dozens of sites across North America, Europe, and Asia, contains things that shouldn't be there. Microscopic diamonds called nanodiamonds, which only form under extreme pressure and heat. Magnetic spherules, tiny balls of melted rock that form when material is vaporized and then rapidly cooled. Iridium, a rare element that's common in asteroids but scarce in Earth's crust. High concentrations of platinum and other metals associated with cosmic impacts. Most tellingly, a black layer of carbon-rich, material that looks exactly like what you'd expect from massive wildfires, continental-scale burning that happened in a very short time. The hypothesis goes like this. A comet, probably part of a larger object that had broken up earlier, entered Earth's atmosphere over North America. It was big, maybe several hundred meters across, moving at tens of thousands of miles per hour. It exploded before hitting the ground, an airburst like the Tunguska event in 1908, but vastly larger. The explosion released energy equivalent to millions of megatons of TNT. Everything within hundreds of miles was instantly incinerated. Trees, animals, and yes, humans. The shockwave flattened forests across thousands of square miles. Ejecta, superheated material thrown into the atmosphere, rained down across the continent, starting fires that burned for weeks, maybe months. But that was just the beginning. The ice sheet covering Canada at the time was thousands of feet thick. The impact or series of impacts melted massive amounts of it instantly. We're talking about cubic miles of ice turning to water in hours or days. This water didn't drain slowly. It catastrophically flooded into the Atlantic Ocean, disrupting the ocean circulation system that regulates global climate. The North Atlantic Current, which brings warm water from the tropics to northern regions, shut down. Europe, which had been warming nicely, suddenly plunged back into freezing conditions. North America, already devastated by the impact, faced brutal winters and shortened growing seasons. And it gets worse. The fires started by the impact ejected so much smoke and ash into the atmosphere that they created a form of impact winter. Sunlight was partially blocked. Temperatures dropped further. Plants that had survived the initial blast couldn't photosynthesize effectively. Herbivores starved. Predators starved. And the humans, the Clovis people who'd successfully colonized North America just a few thousand years earlier, they suddenly faced conditions that made survival almost impossible. The archaeological evidence supports this. The Clovis culture, which had been thriving across North America, essentially vanished at exactly this time. Their distinctive spear points, which are found in abundance in older layers, become rare or absent in layers dating after 12,800 years ago. Sites show evidence of abandonment. Population density crashed. Some researchers estimate that North American human populations declined by 90% or more in the centuries following the Younger Dryas onset. Now, not everyone accepts the impact hypothesis. Critics point out that some of the evidence could have other explanations. Nanodiamonds can form in wildfires under the right conditions. The black carbon layer could be from multiple smaller fires rather than one massive conflagration. The platinum and iridium anomalies aren't found at all sites, suggesting maybe they're not really global markers after all. But here's the thing. Even the critics agree something catastrophic happened 12,800 years ago. The climate reversal is undeniable. It's written in ice cores from Greenland, sediment cores from lakes and oceans, pollen records from bogs and marshes. The evidence of massive wildfires is real. The population decline is documented. The only debate is about what caused it. Impact, meltwater flooding, or some combination of factors we haven't fully understood yet. And the truth is, it probably doesn't matter which specific mechanism triggered the Younger Dryas. What matters is that our ancestors lived through it. They survived the initial catastrophe, whatever it was. Then they endured 1,200 years of brutal climate conditions, shortened growing seasons, unreliable resources, and they remembered. They told stories about fire falling from the sky, about floods that swallowed the world, about the time when everything changed. Those stories, passed down through hundreds of generations, became the flood myths we still know today. But the Younger Dryas was just one piece of a much larger catastrophic puzzle. Because while it was the most dramatic event, it wasn't the only one. The entire period from about 15,000 to 7,000 years ago was marked by repeated disasters, climate shifts, and landscape transformations that would have seemed apocalyptic to anyone living through them. Consider the meltwater pulse events. As the Ice Age ended, the massive ice sheets covering North America and Europe didn't melt gradually. They melted in pulses, catastrophic releases of water that raised global sea levels by dozens of feet in just a few decades or even years. Meltwater Pulse 1A, which occurred around 14,600 years ago, raised sea levels by 50 to 80 feet in less than 500 years. That's more than a foot per decade. Imagine living on a coast during this period. Every generation, the ocean would be noticeably higher. Fishing villages would have to relocate repeatedly. River deltas would transform as rising seas pushed salt water inland. islands would shrink and disappear. But the really terrifying part is that the melting probably wasn't steady. Evidence from sediment cores suggests the sea level rise happened in surges. One year things would be normal. The next year tides would be noticeably higher. Within a decade, coastal areas that had been dry land for generations would be underwater. Communities would wake up to find their territories shrinking, their resources disappearing beneath the waves. Meltwater pulse 1b around 11,500 years ago did it again. Another 50 feet of sea level rise in a few centuries. Then smaller pulses continued for thousands of years. By 7,000 years ago, when sea levels finally stabilized, the ocean had risen over 400 feet from its Ice Age minimum. Entire coastal plains, millions of square miles, of territory that had been inhabited for thousands of years, were gone, drowned beneath hundreds of feet of water. Think about what that means for human populations, some of the best land on the planet, the most productive territories, the places where resources were most abundant, were the coastal plains and river valleys that are now underwater. These would have been prime real estate for Ice Age humans, warmer than inland areas, rich in marine resources, access to rivers for fresh water and transportation. This is where you'd expect to find the highest population densities and the most advanced cultures, and it's all gone. Not destroyed or buried under mud, but literally beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. If there were cities, monuments, or technological achievements in these regions, we'll probably never find them. They're not just lost to history, they're geologically inaccessible. But we don't need to find actual ruins to know this flooding happened. The evidence is everywhere if you know where to look. Sediment cores from the ocean floor show distinct layers marking rapid transgression events. Drowned river channels mapped on the continental shelf show where major rivers once flowed across what is now seafloor. Submerged forests preserved in sediments date to the late Ice Age and show evidence of rapid inundation. Most tellingly, the flood stories themselves. Every coastal culture on Earth has flood myths, not just minor local flooding, but world-ending deluges that transform the landscape and force survivors to start over. These stories are most detailed and dramatic in regions that were most affected by sea level rise. The Persian Gulf region, which was entirely dry land during the Ice Age and became ocean during the meltwater pulse events. The Southeast Asian coast, where thousands of square miles of land the Sunda Shelf was inundated. The Mediterranean, where multiple catastrophic flooding events reshape the entire region. The Black Sea is the poster child for sudden catastrophic flooding. For most of the Ice Age, it wasn't a sea at all. It was a freshwater lake, isolated from the Mediterranean by a land bridge at the Bosporus Strait. The lake was hundreds of feet below modern sea level, surrounded by fertile plains that would have been attractive to early farmers and pastoralists. Then around 7,600 years ago, rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus. What happened next was like something from a disaster movie. Seawater began pouring into the Black Sea basin. Not gradually, not as a trickle, as a waterfall. Researchers estimate water was flowing through the breach at 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls. The noise alone would have been audible for 100 miles. A constant roar as millions of gallons per second carved through the land bridge and cascaded into the lake below. The Black Sea didn't fill slowly. Within months, possibly within weeks, water levels rose by hundreds of feet. The shoreline advanced by as much as a mile per day in some areas. Anyone living around the lake would have had no chance to adapt. You'd go to sleep with the lake shore miles away. You'd wake up to rising water flooding your settlements. Within days, everything would be gone. drowned beneath hundreds of feet of salt water. The evidence is written in the sediment. Below a certain level, Black Sea sediments contain freshwater species. Above that level, marine species. The transition is sharp, occurring over just a few inches of sediment representing perhaps a year or two. Underwater surveys have found ancient shorelines, now 400 feet below the surface, with preserved beaches and even possible remains of human structures. This event, the Black Sea deluge, is now widely accepted by geologists, and it happened at the right time and place to be remembered. The region around the Black Sea was inhabited by farming communities. These weren't hunter-gatherers who could just pick up and move. They had fields, permanent settlements, storage facilities for grain. When the flood came, they lost everything. The survivors would have carried stories of the catastrophe with them as they fled to higher ground and tried to rebuild their lives elsewhere. Some researchers think this is the origin of the Noah's Ark story, a real flood, localized to the Black Sea region but absolutely catastrophic for anyone living there, preserved in cultural memory and eventually incorporated into religious traditions. Whether or not that specific connection is real, the Black Sea deluge proves that yes, sudden catastrophic flooding on a scale that would seem world-ending to anyone experiencing it did actually happen within the span of human memory. And the Black Sea wasn't unique. Similar deluge events happened around the world. The English Channel was created around 450,000 years ago, when a land bridge between Britain and France was breached by a catastrophic megaflood. But smaller, more recent flooding events continued to reshape the region through the end of the Ice Age. The Missoula floods in North America were even more dramatic. During the late Ice Age, an ice dam in what is now Montana created a massive lake, Glacial Lake Missoula, containing more water than Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined. Around 15,000 years ago, the ice dam failed. Not gradually, catastrophically. The entire lake emptied in less than 48 hours. 500 cubic miles of water, moving at up to 80 miles per hour, swept across eastern Washington, scouring the landscape down to bedrock, carrying house-sized boulders hundreds of miles, creating the channeled scablands that still mark the region today. The floodwaters were so deep they temporarily backed up the Columbia River, creating massive lakes that would exist for days before draining. And this didn't happen once. Evidence shows the ice dam reformed and failed repeatedly, maybe 40 times or more over a period of 2,000 years. Every few decades or centuries, the landscape would be reshaped by catastrophic flooding. Any human populations in the region would have had to adapt to periodic world-ending floods that could arrive with little warning and destroy everything in their path. Similar megafloods happened in Siberia when ice-dammed lakes failed there, in Central Asia, in Northern Europe. The late Ice Age wasn't a time of gradual, peaceful change. It was punctuated by repeated catastrophes, each one potentially world-ending for anyone in the wrong place at the wrong time. Then there are the tsunamis. Not modern tsunamis caused by earthquakes, though those have caused their own catastrophes throughout history. We're talking about mega-tsunamis triggered by underwater landslides as the continental shelves adjusted to rising sea levels and deglaciation. The Storegga slide around 8,200 years ago sent a massive tsunami across the North Atlantic. An underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, triggered by melting ice and sediment instability, displaced cubic miles of material. The resulting wave was 60 feet high when it hit the Shetland Islands, 20 feet high along the Norwegian coast, 10 feet high on the eastern coast of Scotland. It would have destroyed coastal settlements throughout the region, drowning thousands of people and permanently altering the coastline. Sediment cores from the North Sea show the tsunami deposit, a distinctive layer of marine sand in what should be coastal marsh sediments. It appears across hundreds of miles of coastline, marking the extent of the inundation. Similar tsunami deposits have been found on coasts around the world, evidence of ancient waves that reshaped shorelines and obliterated coastal populations. All of this, the impacts, the meltwater pulses, the deluge events, the megafloods, the tsunamis, happened within a relatively short span of time at the end of the Pleistocene. From about 15,000 to 7,000 years ago, the Earth was in convulsion. Climate was shifting rapidly. Landscapes were being transformed. Sea levels were rising catastrophically. And humans were living through all of it, adapting, surviving, but also suffering and dying in numbers we can barely comprehend. This brings us to one of the great debates in geology: catastrophism versus uniformitarianism. For most of the 20th century, uniformitarianism was the dominant paradigm, the idea that geological processes have always operated at roughly the same rates they do today. Mountains rise slowly, rivers erode gradually, changes accumulate over millions of years. Catastrophes were rare, localized, and not particularly important for understanding Earth's history. But the evidence from the end of the Ice Age has forced a rethinking. Yes, most of the time geology is gradual, but periodically catastrophes do happen. Impacts, megafloods, rapid climate shifts. These events are rare on geological timescales, but they're common enough on human timescales that every few thousand years something world-changing occurs. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The planet operates mostly through slow, steady processes, but those processes are punctuated by catastrophes, and during periods of rapid change like deglaciation, the catastrophes come more frequently. The end of the Ice Age wasn't normal. It was a time when catastrophic events that might normally happen once every 100,000 years were happening every few thousand years or even more frequently. Our ancestors lived through the catastrophes. They survived the impacts, endured the floods, adapted to the climate shifts. And they remembered. They told story about the time the world ended, about mud and water swallowing civilizations, about survivors starting over in a transformed landscape. Those stories, passed down through hundreds of generations, became the reset myths we still tell today. But here's what's really important. The catastrophes didn't just destroy, they also created. The flooding that drowned coastal plains also created new river deltas and fertile floodplains inland. The climate shifts that devastated some regions made others more habitable. The population disruptions that destroyed some societies created opportunities for new ones to emerge. Catastrophe and renewal, destruction and creation, reset and rebirth. That's the real pattern. Not a single world-ending event, but a cycle of catastrophes and recoveries that has been repeating throughout human history. We're not the first civilization to face planetary-scale disasters. We won't be the last, but we are the first with the scientific tools to understand what happened, learn from it, and maybe, just maybe, prepare for what's coming next. But here's where the story gets really interesting. What if all these flood myths, all this buried mud, all these stories of catastrophic resets aren't just about natural disasters? What if they're memories of something else? Evidence of civilizations that existed before, advanced societies that were wiped out, forcing humanity to start over from scratch. Let's talk about Göbekli Tepe, because nothing should prepare you for what Göbekli Tepe represents. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd named Savak Yildiz noticed some unusual stones sticking out of the ground on a hillside in southeastern Turkey. Archaeologists investigated. What they found rewrote everything we thought we knew about human civilization. Göbekli Tepe is a massive temple complex. Not just big, massive. 20-ton limestone pillars carved with intricate reliefs of animals, circular structures that required sophisticated planning and engineering, astronomical alignments that demonstrate detailed knowledge of celestial mechanics. Here's the thing, though. It's 11,600 years old, built around 9,600 BC, thousands of years before agriculture, before pottery, before metalworking, before any of the technologies we thought were necessary prerequisites for complex construction projects. According to our previous understanding of human history, the people who built Göbekli Tepe should have been hunter-gatherers, small nomadic bands barely scraping by, focused entirely on finding their next meal. They weren't supposed to be building monuments that would challenge modern construction crews. They weren't supposed to have the organizational capacity to mobilize hundreds of workers. They weren't supposed to understand geometry, engineering, or astronomy well enough to create precisely aligned stone circles. But they did, and then they buried it, deliberately, carefully. They filled in the entire complex with earth and debris, preserving it perfectly for 11,000 years, like they wanted someone to find it later, like they were leaving a message. The German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led the excavations until his death in 2014, estimated they'd only uncovered about 5% of the site. Ground-penetrating radar shows at least 20 additional circles still buried. Who knows what else is down there? But Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. It's just the most dramatic example of a pattern that's emerging worldwide. Evidence of sophisticated societies existing thousands of years before our history books say civilization began. Consider the underwater ruins. Off the coast of India near the Gulf of Cambay, sonar surveys have detected massive geometric structures 120 feet below the waves, straight walls, right angles, perfectly rectangular foundations. The Indian National Institute of Ocean Technology investigated. They brought up artifacts, pottery, tools, pieces of worked wood. Carbon dating put some samples at 9,500 years old. The city of Dwarka, sacred to Hindus as the legendary home of Krishna, described in ancient texts as a magnificent metropolis that was swallowed by the sea. For thousands of years, scholars assumed it was pure mythology. Then in the 1980s, marine archaeologists started finding it. Stone structures, walls, pillars, all submerged off the coast of Gujarat. Not just random stones either, organized construction following clear city planning principles. Or take Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan. In 1987, dive tour operators discovered what looks like a massive stepped pyramid underwater. Flat terraces, right angles, what appear to be roads and staircases, all carved from solid bedrock. Geologists argue about whether it's natural or artificial, but even the skeptics admit the formations are unusually regular. If it's man-made, it's been underwater for at least 10,000 years, since that's when sea levels rose enough to submerge it. That means it predates the pyramids of Egypt by 5,000 years, and there are more. Underwater structures off Cuba that sonar suggests might be an entire city at 2,000 feet depth, submerged ruins off the coast of Greece, Malta, the Bahamas, all in locations that were above water during the last ice age, all suggesting the existence of coastal civilizations that vanished when the ice melted and sea levels rose by 400 feet. But here's what really makes you wonder. These pre-flood societies, whoever they were, seem to have possessed knowledge that shouldn't have been possible with their supposed level of technology. Ancient astronomical knowledge that modern science has only recently rediscovered. The Maya calculated the length of the solar year as 2,420 days. Modern astronomy, with all our telescopes and computers, calculates it as 365.2422 days. They were off by 2 days, or about 17 seconds per year, without any optical instruments more sophisticated than crossed sticks. The Egyptian pyramids are aligned to true north, with an accuracy of 3/60th of a single degree. They incorporated the value of pi into their dimensions before pi was supposedly discovered by the Greeks thousands of years later. The Great Pyramid's perimeter divided by its height equals twop. That's not coincidence. That's mathematical knowledge. The ancient Sumerians had a number system based on 60 that allowed them to calculate complex astronomical cycles. They knew about all the planets in our solar system, described them in texts thousands of years old. We didn't rediscover Uranus until 1781, Neptune until 1846, Pluto until 1930. How did Bronze Age cultures with no telescopes know these planets existed? The Antikythera mechanism, pulled from a Roman shipwreck in 1901, is a bronze computer that calculated astronomical positions decades in advance. It contains 30 bronze gears working in precise coordination, representing technological sophistication we didn't see again until medieval clockmakers. It's 2,000 years old, but the knowledge it represents is far older. Somebody, somewhere, had figured out celestial mechanics in extraordinary detail, then passed that knowledge down through generations. Which brings us to Atlantis. Plato described it in his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, around 360 BC. A powerful naval civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time. An advanced society on a large island or continent beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar. According to Plato, Atlantis possessed sophisticated technology, monumental architecture, and a powerful military. Then, in a single day and night of catastrophe, it sank beneath the waves and vanished. For 2,300 years, scholars have debated whether Plato was describing a real place or inventing an allegory to make philosophical points about ideal societies and their corruption. But here's what's interesting. Plato insisted multiple times that the story was true. He claimed his ancestor, Solon, had learned it from Egyptian priests during travels in Egypt. These priests supposedly maintained records going back thousands of years, far beyond Greek historical memory. They told Solon about a great civilization that had been destroyed by floods and earthquakes. Sound familiar? If you accept that Plato might have been working from genuine historical sources, even corrupted ones, then Atlantis stops being mythology and becomes something else. A cultural memory of pre-flood civilization. Not necessarily a specific place, maybe a composite memory of several advanced societies that existed during the Ice Age, when sea levels were 400 feet lower and coastlines extended far beyond their present positions. Societies that built cities in areas that are now underwater. Societies that possessed astronomical and mathematical knowledge we've only recently recovered. Societies that were destroyed when the ice melted and the seas rose, forcing survivors to flee inland and start over with whatever knowledge they could preserve. This is the reset hypothesis, the idea that human civilization is older than we think, that advanced societies have risen and fallen before, leaving only fragmentary memories and puzzling artifacts, that the civilizations we know about, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, aren't the first human civilizations, they're the recovered civilizations. What came after the reset? And there's a genuine puzzle here that mainstream archaeology struggles to explain. Why does civilization appear so suddenly in the archaeological record? For millions of years, human tool technology barely changed. Simple stone tools, basic survival techniques, nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Then suddenly, around 10,000 BC, everything accelerates. Agriculture appears independently in multiple locations within a few thousand years. Pottery, metalworking, writing, mathematics, astronomy all emerge in a relatively brief period. Complex societies with specialized labor, trade networks, and monumental architecture spring up across the globe. It's not a gradual accumulation of knowledge, it's an explosion. Almost like humanity was remembering something rather than inventing it for the first time. The standard explanation is that agriculture caused everything. Evidence. Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture in the region. It was built by hunter-gatherers, which means complex social organization and monumental construction came first. Agriculture came after, possibly as a response to the need to feed the large workforce required for temple building. What if it's the reverse? What if agriculture, and all the technologies we associate with civilization, weren't invented after the flood, but remembered from before it? Survivors of advanced coastal societies, displaced by rising seas, moving inland and trying to recreate what they had lost, teaching farming, metalworking, astronomy to Stone Age populations who had lost those skills or never possessed them. That would explain why these technologies appear so suddenly, and why they appear in forms that already seem sophisticated rather than experimental. It would explain the astronomical knowledge. It would explain the advanced mathematical concepts embedded in ancient structures. It would explain why flood myths describe pre-flood people as more advanced, why they talk about knowledge being lost and partially recovered. And here's the thing, we have evidence of a genuine catastrophic population collapse, a real reset, the genetic bottleneck. Around 70,000 years ago, the human population crashed. Genetic analysis shows that all humans alive today descend from a population of perhaps 10,000 individuals, maybe fewer. Some estimates put it as low as 2,000 breeding pairs. Something nearly wiped us out. The leading candidate is the Toba supervolcanic eruption in Indonesia, the largest explosive volcanic event in the last 2 million years. It ejected 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, enough to bury all of Texas under 15 feet of ash. The eruption caused a volcanic winter that lasted years, possibly decades. Global temperatures dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. Ecosystems collapsed. Food sources vanished. Whatever human populations existed at the time, whatever cultures they'd developed, whatever knowledge they'd accumulated, almost all of it was lost. Only a few thousand individuals survived, scattered in isolated refuges, clinging to existence while the world burned and froze around them. When the volcanic winter finally ended and survivors emerged, they had to rebuild from almost nothing. Most of their cultural knowledge would have been lost. Technologies that required large populations to maintain would have vanished. Complex skills that needed teachers and schools to pass on would have died with their practitioners, but some things might have survived. Oral traditions, stories about what came before, astronomical knowledge encoded in myths and legends, memories of advanced ancestors who built great cities before the catastrophe. These memories would degrade over time, becoming mixed with mythology and supernatural elements, but the core might remain true. Real historical events preserved through thousands of years of storytelling, which brings us to Egypt and one of the most controversial puzzles in archaeology, the Sphinx water erosion controversy. The Great Sphinx of Giza has long been dated to around 2500 BC, built during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre. But in the 1970s, geologist Robert Schoch examined the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure and concluded they were caused by rainfall, not wind and sand. The problem? The Giza Plateau hasn't had enough rainfall to cause that level of erosion in over 7,000 years. The region became arid around 5000 BC. If Schoch is right, the Sphinx must be at least 7,000 years old, possibly much older. Carved during a wetter climate period, then later adopted and modified by the dynastic Egyptians who took credit for it. Mainstream Egyptologists reject this interpretation, arguing that the erosion patterns can be explained by other mechanisms, but Schoch isn't alone. Other geologists and geophysicists have examined the evidence and reached similar conclusions. The Sphinx shows evidence of significant water erosion, and if the Sphinx is older than dynastic Egypt, what else might be? The Egyptian civilization appears fully formed in the archaeological record around 3100 BC. Suddenly, there are massive construction projects, sophisticated hieroglyphic writing, advanced mathematics as astronomy, complex religious systems, almost no gradual development, just boom, complete civilization. Egyptian legends themselves talk about a time before the pharaohs, the Zep Tepi, the first time when gods walked the earth and built the original temples. Mainstream scholars dismiss this as mythology. But what if it's cultural memory? Evidence of a predecessor civilization that existed during the wetter climate period, before the Sahara became desert, a society that built the original structures that dynastic Egyptians later restored and expanded, attributing them to their own kings. Then there are the maps, ancient maps that show knowledge that shouldn't have been possible. The Piri Reis map, created by Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis in 1513, shows the Atlantic coasts of Europe, Africa, and South America with remarkable accuracy, but it also shows the coast of Antarctica. The map depicts the northern coast of Antarctica as ice-free, showing detailed coastline features and river valleys. The problem? Antarctica has been covered by ice for millions of years. We didn't even know Antarctica existed until 1820. How could a 16th century map show its coastline and show it ice-free? Piri Reis noted on the map that he compiled it from older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. He claimed he was copying ancient knowledge, not conducting original surveys. The Orontius Phineus map from 1531 shows all of Antarctica, centered on the South Pole, with detailed interior features that were hidden under ice until we mapped them with seismic surveys in the 1950s. The Mercator maps from 1569 show Antarctica as an archipelago, separate large islands. Modern surveys using ice-penetrating radar have confirmed that underneath the ice sheet, Antarctica is indeed an archipelago. Without the ice, it would be multiple large islands. The standard explanation is coincidence. Maybe these cartographers were creatively filling in unknown regions, and by pure chance they happen to draw something that resembles the actual geography. But the details are oddly specific. River valleys where seismic data shows bedrock valleys exist under the ice, mountain ranges in the correct locations, coastline features that match modern surveys. If these maps were compiled from older sources, as their creators claimed, then those sources must have been based on surveys conducted when Antarctica was ice-free. That last happened over 6,000 years ago, possibly much longer. Who was sailing to Antarctica 6,000 years ago? Who had the navigational technology and shipbuilding skills to conduct maritime surveys of the polar regions? We're not supposed to have had those capabilities until the age of exploration in the 15th century. But the maps exist. The knowledge they represent is real, which points to one of two conclusions. Either ancient civilizations possessed maritime and cartographic technologies far more advanced than we've given them credit for, or these maps preserve knowledge from an even earlier period, from before the last ice age, when sea levels were lower and different civilizations than the ones we know about dominated the coasts. The reset hypothesis tries to make sense of all these puzzles. The sudden appearance of advanced knowledge, the underwater ruins in locations that were above water during the Ice Age, the flood myths found in every culture, the astronomical and mathematical sophistication that appears fully formed, the maps that shouldn't exist, the structures that predate known civilization. It suggests a simple explanation. Human civilization is older than we think. Advanced societies existed before, probably during the last ice age when geography was completely different. These societies built cities along ice age coastlines that are now underwater. They developed sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and navigation. Then they were destroyed. Maybe by the floods that came when the ice melted. Maybe by the Younger Dryas impact event 12,800 years ago, when something, possibly a comet fragment, struck the North American ice sheet and caused catastrophic climate disruption. Maybe by a combination of disasters that effectively reset human civilization. Survivors fled inland, carrying whatever knowledge they could preserve. They taught Stone Age populations agriculture, building techniques, astronomical observations. But much was lost. Technologies that required industrial infrastructure vanished. Scientific knowledge survived only in fragmentary form mixed with mythology. Over thousands of years, the memory of what came before faded into legend. Stories about Atlantis, about golden ages, about gods who brought civilization. But the evidence remains. Underwater cities, astronomical alignments, ancient maps, genetic bottlenecks, the mud that buried everything. Mainstream archaeology resists this interpretation, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because accepting it would require rewriting our entire understanding of human prehistory, admitting that we might not be the first technological civilization, that we might be rebuilding something that was built before, that the march of progress isn't a straight line upward, but a cycle. Rise, fall, reset, rise again. But resistance is weakening. Each new discovery makes the standard timeline harder to defend. Each underwater structure that predates known civilization. Each example of astronomical knowledge that shouldn't have been possible. Each flood myth that turns out to preserve genuine historical memories. We might be living after a reset, descendants of survivors who rebuilt civilization from fragmentary memories of what came before, standing on the shoulders of forgotten giants, building with knowledge that was ancient when Sumer was young, and if it's happened before, it could happen again. That's the unsettling thought that keeps you awake at night. The idea that everything we've built, all our technology and knowledge and civilization, could be buried under mud for future archaeologists to puzzle over. That we could become the Atlantis of some future age, just another lost civilization remembered in myth and legend, another layer in the geological record, more evidence that humanity keeps reaching for the stars and keeps getting knocked back down to start over. But for now, we can still dig, still explore the ruins beneath the waves, still decode the astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient structures, still read the maps that show ice-free Antarctica, still ask questions about Göbekli Tepe and the Sphinx and all the other mysteries that suggest our history is longer and stranger than we've been taught. The mud buried the evidence, but it also preserved it, and we're finally learning to read what it's trying to tell us. So let's talk about the mud. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. What is this stuff that supposedly buried civilizations? Where did it come from? And more importantly, can geology actually support the idea of catastrophic mud deposits covering entire cities in a matter of days, weeks, or even years? Because here's the thing, when you start digging into the mud flood theory, you eventually have to confront the actual dirt. And dirt doesn't lie. It can't be manipulated by revisionists or hidden by conspiracies. Sediment layers are like geological time capsules. Each one tells a story about how it got there, when it arrived, and what happened before and after. So if cities really were buried under waves of mud in some kind of global reset event, the geological evidence should be screaming at us from every excavation site. And some of it actually is, just not in the way the mud flood theorists expect. Let's start with Los. That's Los. And if you've never heard of it, you're not alone. Most people haven't, but Los is absolutely critical to understanding how landscapes can get buried under meters of sediment without any floods, earthquakes, or catastrophes at all. Los is wind-blown sediment, tiny particles of silt ground up by glaciers during ice ages, then picked up by wind and deposited across vast areas. And when I say vast, I mean continental scale. During the last glacial maximum, Los covered huge portions of North America, Europe, and Asia. The Chinese Los Plateau contains sediment deposits up to 300 meters thick in some places. That's nearly 1,000 feet of accumulated dust. The American Midwest sits on Los deposits that are tens of meters deep across millions of square kilometers. Now here's what makes Los interesting for our discussion. It accumulates slowly, but it accumulates continuously. Year after year, century after century, microscopic particles settle out of the air and build up on the surface. The rate varies, maybe a millimeter per year in some areas, maybe less in others. But over thousands of years this stuff adds up, and because it's so fine-grained and uniform, it creates exactly the kind of smooth, deep sediment layers that mud flood proponents point to as evidence of catastrophic burial. Except there's no catastrophe, just wind, lots of wind, blowing for thousands of years. You can tell Los from other sediments because of its structure. Under a microscope, Los particles are angular, showing they were ground up by ice rather than rounded by water. The deposits are remarkably well sorted, meaning all the particles are about the same size because wind is an excellent sorting mechanism. Heavy particles drop out first, light particles stay airborne longer. And crucially, Los deposits show consistent layering that matches climate cycles. You can read Ice Age advances and retreats in Los stratigraphy like pages in a book. So when you see a building that appears to be partially buried, first windows below street level, foundations that seem too deep, sometimes the answer is simply Los accumulation over centuries. No flood required, no catastrophe needed, just time and wind. But Los isn't the only natural explanation for rapid burial. Let's talk about volcanic ash. Now this is where things get genuinely catastrophic, because volcanic eruptions absolutely can bury entire cities under meters of material in a matter of hours or days. Pompeii is the famous example. When Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, it buried the city under 4 to 6 meters of volcanic ash and pumice. The eruption happened so fast that people were caught mid-stride, preserved in the exact positions they died. That's genuine catastrophic burial. But here's what's important. Volcanic ash has a very distinctive signature. It's composed of volcanic glass and crystals. It has specific chemical compositions that identify exactly which volcano it came from, and it contains no organic material, no soil components, nothing that would be present in flood sediment or river mud. When archaeologists excavate a site buried in volcanic ash, they know immediately what they're dealing with. The ash layers are obvious. They're different colours than surrounding soil, usually grey or black or reddish depending on the magma composition. They contain pumice fragments, volcanic bombs, all the telltale signs of explosive eruption. And crucially, volcanic ash layers can be dated with remarkable precision using multiple techniques. The most powerful recent volcanic event that could explain widespread burial is the Toba super eruption about 74,000 years ago. It deposited ash across South and Southeast Asia. In some areas, the ash layer is 6 meters thick. It cooled global temperatures for years, maybe decades. It might have contributed to the genetic bottleneck in human populations we discussed earlier. But here's the thing about Toba. We can trace its ash across thousands of kilometers. Every deposit has the same chemical signature. Every layer dates to exactly the same time period. This is what genuine catastrophic volcanic burial looks like, and it looks nothing like the mud deposits in supposedly buried cities. Most of those deposits are soil, organic-rich sediment, river alluvium, the kind of material that accumulates through normal geological processes, not volcanic catastrophe. Then there's liquefaction. And this is where earthquake geology gets really interesting. Liquefaction happens when water-saturated sediment is shaken by seismic waves. The shaking increases pore water pressure until the sediment loses strength and starts behaving like a liquid instead of a solid. Buildings can sink, ground can flow like a thick mud. Structures that were on solid ground suddenly find themselves tilting, sinking, or buried under sediment that flowed in from surrounding areas. The 1964 Alaska earthquake produced extensive liquefaction. Entire neighborhoods in Anchorage slumped and flowed downhill. The 2011 Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand caused liquefaction that buried streets and first floors of buildings under ejected sediment. These are real, documented events that absolutely can bury structures rapidly. But liquefaction has very specific signatures. The sediment shows deformation structures, lode casts, flame structures, convoluted bedding, all signs that it was shaken and deformed while saturated with water. You see sand volcanoes where liquefied material erupted at the surface. You see lateral spreading where entire blocks of ground moved sideways. And importantly, liquefaction is a local phenomenon. It affects specific types of sediment in specific geological settings. You don't get global liquefaction. You don't get liquefaction that simultaneously affects every city on every continent. When geologists examine supposedly buried structures and claim they show evidence of liquefaction, they need to demonstrate those diagnostic features: lode casts, deformation structures, lateral continuity of affected layers. Without that evidence, you're just looking at normal sediment, accumulation that happened to bury older structures over time. River flooding is probably the most common natural explanation for buried structures. Rivers are constantly depositing sediment, building up floodplains, raising their beds, burying whatever happens to be in their path. The difference between normal flooding and catastrophic flooding is mostly a matter of timescale and intensity. Normal river flooding happens annually or seasonally. Each flood deposits a thin layer of sediment, maybe millimeters or centimeters. Over centuries this adds up. Archaeological sites along major rivers often show occupation layers separated by flood deposits. People lived there, flood came, People rebuilt on top of the flood layer, process repeated for generations. This creates a tell, an artificial mound made up of alternating occupation and abandonment layers. But catastrophic floods are different. These are the ones that happen when natural dams break, when glacial lakes drain suddenly, when unusual climate conditions create flooding far beyond normal parameters. The Missoula floods at the end of the last ice age are the classic example. A glacial lake in Montana, held back by an ice dam, broke through catastrophically, released a volume of water equivalent to Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined, flowing across eastern Washington at speeds up to 65 miles per hour. The erosion and deposition from these floods carved the channeled scablands, a landscape so alien that geologists initially couldn't believe water had created it. But here's what's crucial. The Missoula floods left distinctive evidence. Giant current ripples, deposits of boulders the size of houses transported by the floodwaters, scoured bedrock channels, erratic placement of sediments. When geologists look at these deposits, there's no question what created them. The evidence is overwhelming and consistent. If similar catastrophic floods had buried cities globally, we should see similar evidence everywhere. Giant erosion features, massively oversized channels, boulder deposits in places they shouldn't be, sediment compositions indicating transport from distant sources. And we do see some of these features in specific locations related to specific events, but we don't see them globally. We don't see them at the right time periods, and we don't see them associated with most of the supposedly buried structures. What we see instead is normal alluvial deposition, river sediment accumulating gradually over centuries, exactly what you'd expect from cities built on floodplains that continued to flood long after the cities were abandoned. Then there are tsunamis, and tsunami-generated mud waves are genuinely terrifying. When a tsunami comes ashore, it doesn't just bring water, it brings everything the water picks up on its way inland. Sediment, debris, vegetation, parts of buildings, vehicles, whatever the wave can move. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami deposited sand layers up to 20 centimeters thick across coastal areas. The 2011 Tohoku tsunami in Japan created sediment deposits that will be visible in the geological record for millennia. Tsunami deposits have distinctive characteristics. They're usually sand layers deposited over soil or vegetation. They show grading, with coarser material at the bottom and finer material at the top, indicating deposition from a single waning flow. They contain marine shells and organisms transported inland. They extend inland as continuous sheets that thin and fine in the landward direction, and they're bracketed by soil layers that can be dated, giving you a precise age for the tsunami event. Geologists can identify ancient tsunami deposits going back thousands of years. The Cascadia subduction zone off the Pacific Northwest has generated massive tsunamis repeatedly over the past few thousand years. Each one left sediment layers that are still visible in coastal marshes. By counting and dating these layers, scientists have reconstructed a timeline of major earthquakes and tsunamis going back 10,000 years. This is rigorous science. When researchers claim a sediment layer is a tsunami deposit, they have to demonstrate all the diagnostic features, the marine signature, the grading, the lateral continuity, the stratigraphic position. You can't just point at a layer of mud and claim tsunami without evidence. And when you look at the mud layers in supposedly buried cities, most of them don't show tsunami characteristics. They show gradual accumulation, soil formation, bioturbation from plant roots and burrowing animals, all signs of normal deposition over extended time periods. But let's dig deeper into the mud itself. Compositional analysis can tell us exactly where sediment came from and how it got there. Modern analytical techniques can identify the source rocks that produced the sediment. They can detect volcanic ash even when it's mixed with other materials. They can identify marine versus freshwater versus terrestrial signatures. They can even tell you the season when sediment was deposited based on pollen and microscopic organisms. When geologists analyze sediment from archaeological sites, they're not just guessing about origins and depositional mechanisms. They're conducting detailed laboratory analyses that provide hard data about composition, source, transport mechanism, and deposition environment. And here's what those analyses consistently show. The sediment burying most old structures is local. It came from surrounding soils, from nearby rivers, from hill slopes eroding naturally over time. It wasn't transported thousands of miles by megafloods. It wasn't ejected from distant volcanoes. It didn't arrive in a single catastrophic event. It accumulated gradually, the way sediment always accumulates in urban environments when people stop maintaining streets and buildings. This brings us to the dating controversies, because mudflood proponents often claim that conventional dating techniques are wrong, that the timelines established by mainstream geology are manipulated or mistaken. So let's talk about how we actually date sediments, and why the methods are more reliable than critics claim. Carbon-14 dating is the most famous technique. It works because living organisms incorporate radioactive carbon-14 from the atmosphere while they're alive. When they die, this C14 starts decaying at a known rate, with a half-life of 5,730 years. By measuring how much C14 remains in organic material, you can calculate how long ago the organism died. The technique works reliably back to about 50,000 years. Beyond that, there's not enough C14 left to measure accurately. But within its range, radiocarbon dating is remarkably precise. Multiple labs analyzing the same sample will get consistent results within small margins of error. Critics claim C14 dating is unreliable because the amount of atmospheric carbon-14 has varied over time. And that's true. Solar activity, ocean circulation, industrial emissions, all these factors affect atmospheric C14 levels. But scientists know this. They've spent decades creating calibration curves using tree rings, coral growth bands, and other independently dated materials. Modern radiocarbon dates are calibrated against these curves to correct for atmospheric variations. The result is dates that are accurate to within a few decades for material less than 2,000 years old, and within a century or two for older material. That's not perfect, but it's pretty damn good. And when you date multiple samples from the same sediment layer, and they all give consistent ages, and those ages make sense relative to layers above and below, you can be confident the dates are real. Dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, is even more precise. Trees add one growth ring per year, wide rings in good years, narrow rings in bad years. The pattern of wide and narrow rings creates a unique signature for each sequence of years. By matching ring patterns from living trees to older dead trees to ancient preserved wood, scientists have built continuous tree ring chronologies going back over 12,000 years in some regions. When you find wood in a sediment layer, you can sometimes match its ring pattern to the master chronology and determine the exact year the tree was cut. Not approximate, not within a few decades, exact. And tree ring chronologies confirm radiocarbon dating. When you date wood of known age using C14, the radiocarbon date matches the tree ring date after calibration. This cross-verification between independent methods is powerful evidence that both techniques are measuring real time. But alternative theorists still dispute these timelines. They argue for rapid burial, for catastrophic events that deposited meters of sediment in days or weeks, instead of centuries or millennia, and this is where we need to talk about the fundamental debate in geology. Catastrophism versus uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism is the principle that geological processes operating today are the same processes that operated in the past. Rivers erode and deposit sediment today, so ancient sediment layers were formed by similar rivers. Volcanoes erupt today, so ancient ash layers came from similar eruptions. This doesn't mean everything happens slowly. It just means the laws of physics and chemistry don't change. Catastrophism is the idea that major geological features were formed by sudden, violent events rather than gradual processes. For most of geological history, catastrophism was rejected by mainstream science. But in recent decades, geologists have recognized that catastrophic events do play important roles. The asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs, the Missoula floods, massive volcanic eruptions, these are real catastrophes that shaped landscapes rapidly. The modern view is neo-catastrophism. Most geological change happens gradually, but catastrophic events punctuate the slow processes, creating rapid changes that are preserved in the rock record. The key is evidence. When catastrophic events happen, they leave distinctive signatures, and when you don't see those signatures, you can't invoke catastrophe to explain normal deposits. This is the problem with mudflood theories that claim rapid global burial. The sediments don't show catastrophic signatures. They show slow accumulation, soil formation, gradual burial over centuries, and the dating confirms this. Artifacts from lower levels are older. Artifacts from upper levels are younger, exactly as you'd expect from gradual deposition. But the debate continues because there's something psychologically compelling about catastrophism. Slow processes are boring. Catastrophes are dramatic. And humans are pattern-seeking creatures who love connecting dots into grand narratives. When you see buried first floors, it's more satisfying to imagine a great flood that buried everything at once than to accept that streets gradually rose as centuries of dust and garbage accumulated. When you see similar architectural styles in different countries, it's more exciting to imagine a lost global civilization than to accept that good building techniques spread through trade and cultural contact. The mud doesn't care about our narratives. It just sits there, layer upon layer, waiting for anyone careful enough to read what it actually says. And what it says consistently across thousands of sites on every continent is that the world is old. Changes happen gradually with occasional catastrophes mixed in, and cities get buried 1 year at a time, not one flood at a time. But that doesn't mean the mud has nothing interesting to tell us, because sometimes, when you dig deep enough, you find layers that don't quite fit the gradual model. Sediments that accumulated faster than they should have, deposits that seem out of place. And those anomalies, those places where the mud whispers something unexpected, those are worth investigating further. Here's something that will bend your mind. In the 1980s, Australian anthropologists started taking Aboriginal oral traditions seriously as potential historical records. Not just cultural stories, but actual accounts of events that happened thousands of years ago. What they found was extraordinary. Aboriginal Australians had stories about when the sea level was lower, when you could walk to islands that now separated by miles of ocean, when the coastline was completely different. The anthropologists thought, okay, interesting mythology. Then they checked the geological record. Sea levels rose dramatically after the last ice age ended around 11,700 years ago. The coastlines the Aboriginal stories described, they matched the actual prehistoric geography almost perfectly. These weren't vague myths about water and land. These were specific, detailed accounts of landscapes that had been underwater for more than 10,000 years. Think about that for a second. 10,000 years. That's 400 generations. That's longer than all of recorded human history. That's twice as old as the pyramids. And somehow, Aboriginal Australians had maintained accurate oral records of what the world looked like before the oceans rose. They remembered islands that disappeared beneath the waves when their ancestors' ancestors' were young. They preserved stories about coastal features that had been submerged since the end of the Pleistocene. This wasn't mythology. This was history transmitted through the most vulnerable possible medium. Human memory and human speech across a time span that should have erased every detail. But it gets better. In the early 2000s, geologist Patrick Nunn started systematically comparing Aboriginal stories to the geological record of sea level change. He found 21 separate Aboriginal traditions from around Australia that described specific geographic features, former coastlines, islands that became hills when the sea rose, bays that used to be river valleys. Then he dated the geological changes these stories described. The average age of the events in these stories? About 13,000 years. Some were as old as 18,000 years. This means Aboriginal Australians had been passing down accurate historical information for nearly 20,000 years. Not in writing, not in monuments, just in stories told from grandparent to grandchild, generation after generation after generation, for 700 generations. Now, if humans can preserve accurate geographical information for 20,000 years through oral tradition, what else might they have preserved? What about catastrophes? What about disasters so devastating that they became seared into collective memory? What about events so traumatic that forgetting them would be literally unthinkable? Because here's what we know about memory and trauma. The bigger the disaster, the more reliably it gets remembered. Ask anyone who lived through a major earthquake or tsunami or hurricane. They remember. They remember in vivid, specific detail. They remember what they were doing, what they heard, what they saw, what they felt, and they tell those stories. They tell them to their children and their grandchildren because the lesson is too important to forget. This happened here. It could happen again. Remember. Now scale that up to a civilization-ending catastrophe. A flood that destroys cities, a rain of fire from the sky, a darkness that covers the earth, mud that buries everything your people built. That's not just memorable. That's the kind of event that becomes the central organizing myth of an entire culture. Every ritual, every tradition, every warning passed down to the next generation traces back to that one moment when the world almost ended, when everything our ancestors built was destroyed, when we had to start over from nothing. This is where the flood myths come from, not from confused primitives trying to explain natural phenomena they didn't understand. From survivors of actual catastrophes trying to warn their descendants about what had happened and what could happen again. The problem is that over thousands of years the stories changed. They had to. Because oral tradition isn't like written history. You can't just refer back to an original text. Every telling is a new creation, filtered through the understanding and purposes of the teller. So the historical details get wrapped in symbolic language. The specific geography becomes mythological. The actual sequence of events gets rearranged to create a better narrative. But the core memory remains. Something happened, something terrible, and we survived. This is why flood myths from completely isolated cultures share such similar elements. Not because they borrowed from each other, not because there's some universal human archetype, because they're all describing the same event or the same type of event. Real catastrophic floods that really happened. Maybe at different times, maybe in different places, but similar enough in their effects that the stories about them ended up similar too. The waters rose, the old world was destroyed, a few survivors escaped, they landed on a mountain or an island, they started over. That's the template. That's what gets preserved across 10,000 years of oral transmission, even as the specific details shift and transform. But some groups did more than just tell stories. Some groups recognized that certain types of knowledge were too important to trust to casual oral tradition, too important to risk being garbled or lost or misunderstood by people who didn't appreciate their significance. So they created systems for preserving that knowledge in more reliable forms. They created priesthoods, mystery schools, initiatory traditions where knowledge was passed down in structured, ritualized ways that minimized the risk of corruption. These weren't just religious institutions. They were information preservation systems, libraries without books, universities without buildings, just carefully structured chains of teachers and students, each generation receiving the knowledge from the previous one and passing it on to the next. The ancient Egyptian priesthood is a perfect example. They maintained incredibly precise astronomical observations across thousands of years. They tracked the movements of stars and planets with accuracy that rivals modern measurements. They knew about the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the positions of stars to shift over thousands of years. This isn't casual stargazing. This is systematic data collection maintained across dozens of generations. Why? Because they were trying to predict cycles, trying to understand patterns in celestial events that might correlate with disasters on Earth, trying to figure out when the next catastrophe might come. Their calendar system wasn't just for tracking agricultural seasons. It was a sophisticated astronomical computer designed to predict cosmic events that their traditions told them could trigger earthly disasters. The same thing shows up in Mesopotamia, in China, in Mesoamerica. Everywhere you find advanced ancient civilizations, you find astronomical priesthoods obsessively tracking the movements of celestial bodies and encoding that information in calendar systems of extraordinary complexity. They weren't doing this for fun. They were trying to predict the next reset, trying to figure out if there was a pattern, a cycle, a warning sign that would tell them when the next catastrophe was coming. The Maya were particularly obsessed with this. Their long count calendar measured time in enormous cycles of 5,125 years. Their mythology spoke explicitly about previous world ages that had been destroyed by various catastrophes. Fire, flood, wind, jaguars. Each age ended in destruction. Each time the gods had to create the world again. Some scholars think these weren't just abstract religious ideas. They were historical records, accounts of real catastrophic events preserved in mythological language. The Maya weren't predicting the end of the world in 2012 like popular culture claimed. They were marking the end of one cycle and the beginning of another, based on patterns they thought they had detected in the deep past. But the most interesting preservation system was the mystery schools. These were secret societies that required initiates to go through elaborate rituals and tests before receiving access to higher levels of knowledge. The ancient Greek mystery cults, the Egyptian mystery schools, the various initiatory traditions found across the ancient world. Why all the secrecy? Why the elaborate rituals and oaths of silence? because they were protecting dangerous knowledge, information that could be dangerous if misunderstood, information that could be lost if shared too freely with people who wouldn't appreciate its importance. Some researchers think these mystery schools were preserving pre-catastrophe knowledge, technical information about astronomy, geometry, mathematics, even engineering that had survived from civilizations that existed before the last major reset. Knowledge that would have seemed impossibly advanced to people living in the aftermath of catastrophe. Knowledge that needed to be preserved in secret because the larger population wouldn't understand it or believe it or know what to do with it. So they wrapped it in symbolism and ritual. They made it sacred. They restricted access to ensure that only those who had proven themselves worthy would receive it. And they passed it down through initiated lineages for thousands of years. The symbolism in these traditions is remarkably consistent across cultures. There's always a flood or catastrophe, always a destruction of the old world, always a few survivors who preserve the knowledge, always a rebuilding, always a warning that it could happen again. This shows up in Freemasonry, which claims descent from ancient mystery traditions. It shows up in alchemy, which encoded chemical and philosophical knowledge in elaborate symbolic language. It shows up in the mystery cults of Greece and Rome. The core narrative is always the same. We had knowledge, we lost it, we're trying to recover it, and we need to be ready for when the next catastrophe comes. Now, skeptics will say this is just humans telling stories, that we naturally create narratives about disasters because we're storytelling creatures, that the similarities between myths prove nothing except that humans everywhere face similar anxieties about destruction and survival. And okay, there's something to that. We do love a good catastrophe story, but that doesn't explain the specific details that match geological events. It doesn't explain the astronomical precision of ancient calendar systems. It doesn't explain why isolated cultures with no contact developed remarkably similar preservation systems for protecting important knowledge. Consider the Younger Dryas boundary. This is a layer of sediment found across North America and parts of Europe that dates to around 12,800 years ago. It contains evidence of massive wildfires, the kind that could only be caused by something catastrophic. Many researchers think this layer marks the impact of a comet or asteroid that exploded in the atmosphere, triggering climate change and mass extinctions. The Younger Dryas period that followed was a sudden return to Ice Age conditions that lasted for about 1,300 years. Temperature dropped dramatically, ice sheets advanced again, ecosystems collapsed, and many of the large mammals that had survived the Ice Age went extinct. For humans living through this, it would have been apocalyptic. Climate that had been improving suddenly reversed. Food sources disappeared. Entire regions became uninhabitable. Populations that had been growing and expanding suddenly faced extinction. And here's the thing. This timing, 12,800 years ago, matches up almost perfectly with the dating of many flood myths and catastrophe stories. The Aboriginal Australian traditions about sea level rise, the Mesopotamian flood narratives, the stories about worldwide disasters found across dozens of cultures. They're all describing events that happened right around the time of the Younger Dryas impact event. This suggests these myths aren't just vague stories about natural disasters. They're specific cultural memories of real, catastrophic events that happened at the end of the last ice age. Events so devastating that they became imprinted on human consciousness. Events that every surviving culture felt compelled to remember and pass down to future generations. The details got mythologized over thousands of years of oral transmission, but the core memory remained. Something terrible happened. The world changed. We almost didn't make it, but we survived. And we need to remember so we can be ready if it happens again. This explains why reset myths appear in isolated cultures with no contact. It's not because they borrowed from each other. It's not because there's some universal human archetype about destruction and renewal. It's because they all experienced the same catastrophic period in human history. The end of the last ice age was devastating for human populations everywhere. Sea levels rose hundreds of feet, flooding coastal regions where most human populations lived. Climate shifted rapidly and unpredictably. Familiar ecosystems vanished. The old world, the world that had existed during the stable period before the Younger Dryas, was destroyed. Every surviving culture had its own experience of this catastrophe, its own stories about how their ancestors survived. But the basic narrative was the same because the basic experience was the same, and some cultures went further than just remembering. They tried to preserve technical knowledge that might help future generations survive the next catastrophe. This is why you find sophisticated astronomical knowledge in ancient civilizations that supposedly didn't have the technology to make such precise observations. Why you find mathematical constants encoded in the dimensions of pyramids and temples. Why you find geometric knowledge in megalithic structures that predates recorded mathematics by thousands of years. This wasn't religious symbolism. This was information preservation. People who knew catastrophe could come again, trying to pass down knowledge that might help their descendants survive or rebuild. The priesthoods and mystery schools weren't just protecting religious secrets. They were protecting the accumulated wisdom of pre-catastrophe. Civilizations. Knowledge about astronomy so future generations could predict cosmic events. Knowledge about engineering so they could build structures that would survive disasters. Knowledge about agriculture and animal husbandry so they could restart civilization if it collapsed. Knowledge about mathematics and geometry and medicine and navigation, all wrapped in myth and symbol and ritual because there was no writing system yet, or because writing couldn't be trusted to survive the next catastrophe, or because the knowledge was so advanced that it needed to be protected from misuse. This is the real meaning of cultural memory, not just stories told around fires, not just traditions passed from parents to children, but systematic, organized efforts to preserve information across time spans that would challenge even modern storage systems. These ancient peoples knew something we've forgotten. That civilization is fragile. That catastrophe can destroy everything in a generation. That knowledge, once lost, might take thousands of years to rediscover. So they built information preservation systems that could survive when cities couldn't. Systems encoded in myth and ritual and sacred tradition. Systems designed to outlast stone and bronze and paper. And incredibly, it worked. We're still finding evidence of this ancient knowledge, still discovering that myths we dismissed as primitive superstition contain accurate information about events that happened thousands of years ago, still realizing that the primitive peoples who built megalithic structures and tracked celestial cycles weren't primitive at all. They were survivors of catastrophe, doing everything in their power to ensure their descendants would be ready when the next reset came. They were us, just living in a different time, facing different challenges, but driven by the same fear that motivates our modern doomsday preppers and disaster planners, the fear that everything we've built could be destroyed, the determination to preserve what matters most, the hope that if we can just pass down the right knowledge, our children's children might survive what we couldn't. So here's the uncomfortable question we've been building toward this whole time. If massive resets happened before, If civilizations really did get buried under mud and forgotten, if our ancestors survived catastrophes that nearly ended human existence entirely, what does that mean for us, right now, today, sitting in our climate-controlled rooms, scrolling through our phones, convinced that progress only moves in one direction, forward, because we've been sold a story about history. It's the narrative of linear progress, the idea that humanity started in caves, slowly figured things out, and has been climbing steadily upward ever since. Sure, there were setbacks, the fall of Rome, the Dark Ages, occasional plagues and wars. But the overall trajectory is always up. Better technology, more knowledge, increasing complexity and sophistication. This is the story we tell ourselves, the one that makes us feel safe. But what if that's not how it actually works? What if history isn't a line at all, but a cycle? Civilizations rising, reaching peaks of complexity and achievement, then collapsing back down to basics. Not because humans got dumber or lazier, but because something external, something beyond their control, hit the reset button. And here's the thing that should keep you awake at night. Not in a scary way, but in a thinking deeply about reality kind of way. The geological and astronomical evidence suggests that Earth experiences regular catastrophic events. Not just random bad luck, but predictable cycles of disaster that recur with disturbing regularity. Solar events, for example. Our sun isn't the stable, reliable fusion reactor we'd like to believe. It goes through cycles of activity and dormancy. Most of these cycles are relatively mild. Sunspots come and go, solar winds vary in intensity. But occasionally, maybe every few thousand years, the sun produces what scientists call a micronova, or superflare. A massive ejection of charged particles and electromagnetic radiation that can strip away portions of Earth's atmosphere, cause global wildfires, and fundamentally alter the climate for generations. We know this happens because we can see the evidence in ice cores and tree rings. Layers of unusual isotopes that could only have been created by intense cosmic radiation. Burn layers in sediment cores showing simultaneous wildfires across multiple continents. The geological record is screaming that these events occur regularly. Yet somehow we've built a civilization that assumes they won't happen again. Then there are cosmic impacts, asteroids and comets. We've gotten better at tracking the big ones, the planet-killer rocks that could end human civilization entirely. But there are thousands of smaller objects that we haven't catalogued. Rocks big enough to devastate entire regions, trigger tsunamis, throw enough dust into the atmosphere to cause crop failures worldwide. The Tunguska event in 1908 flattened 800 square miles of Siberian forest. If that had happened over a major city, millions would have died, and we had absolutely no warning, no way to predict it, no way to prevent it. Some researchers think impacts like this might be periodic, not random. The solar system's passage through certain regions of space could expose Earth to increased bombardment from cometary debris. If true, and the evidence is actually pretty compelling, then impacts might cluster in time. Long periods of relative calm, then sudden episodes where multiple strikes occur within centuries of each other. Exactly the pattern you'd expect if ancient reset myths were recording actual events. And then there's the really controversial stuff. Pole shifts. Not the gradual wandering that Earth's magnetic poles do constantly, but rapid catastrophic flips where the entire magnetic field weakens or reverses. During these events, Earth loses much of its protection from cosmic radiation. The magnetosphere that shields us from solar wind and galactic cosmic rays weakens dramatically. anything living on the surface gets hit with radiation levels that can cause mutations, cancer, and widespread ecosystem collapse. We know magnetic reversals happen. The geological record shows they've occurred hundreds of times throughout Earth's history. What we don't know is exactly how long they take or what the immediate effects are. But some researchers think rapid pole shifts could explain some of the mystery in the archaeological record. Sudden abandonment of cities, mass migration events, the collapse of multiple civilizations within short time periods. If the magnetic field weakened rapidly, making certain latitudes uninhabitable due to radiation, people would have no choice but to move fast. Now, you might be thinking this all sounds like fringe catastrophism, the kind of stuff that belongs on conspiracy theory websites, not in serious discussions about history and future risk. But here's the problem with dismissing it entirely. We've already experienced a preview of what solar catastrophe looks like, and it almost destroyed modern civilization. September 1859, the Carrington event. Astronomers observed massive solar flares erupting from the sun. Within hours, the charged particles reached Earth. Telegraph systems worldwide went haywire. Operators received electric shocks from their equipment. Telegraph papers spontaneously caught fire. In some places, telegraphs continued operating even after being disconnected from their power sources. The induced currents in the wires were that strong. Auroras appeared as far south as the Caribbean. People in the Rocky Mountains woke up at 1 a.m. thinking it was dawn because the sky was so bright. This was 1859. The total extent of our electrical infrastructure was telegraph wires. Imagine the same event today. Every power grid on the daylight side of Earth would be hit with massive induced currents. Transformers would explode. Power stations would catch fire. Within hours, maybe minutes, we'd lose electrical power across entire continents. No electricity means no refrigeration, no water pumping, no sewage treatment, no communication systems, no internet, no phones, no way to coordinate response or recovery. Modern cities would become uninhabitable within days, not because of the solar storm itself, but because everything we depend on would simply stop working. The economic damage would be measured in trillions of dollars. The death toll, primarily from disease and starvation as supply chains collapsed, could reach hundreds of millions, and the recovery time? Estimates range from months to years to perhaps never. Because the transformers and specialized equipment needed to rebuild the grid take months to manufacture under ideal conditions. With global supply chains disrupted, manufacturing, facilities offline, and society in chaos, who's going to build new transformers? NASA estimates the probability of a Carrington-level event hitting Earth in the next decade at about 12%. Those aren't terrible odds for any single year, but over a century. The probability becomes near certainty. We will experience another major solar storm. The question isn't if, but when, and whether we'll have prepared for it. We haven't, by the way. Despite knowing about the risk, despite having decades to harden our infrastructure, we've done almost nothing. Because preparing for low-probability, high-impact events is politically difficult and expensive. Much easier to assume it won't happen on our watch and leave the problem for future generations. Exactly the kind of thinking that makes civilizations vulnerable to reset events. And then there's the slow-motion catastrophe we're living through right now. Climate change, sea level rise, not dramatic enough for Hollywood disaster movies, but potentially devastating in ways that echo those ancient mudflood stories. Because here's what happens when sea levels rise. It's not just that coastlines move inland. It's that cities built on river deltas and most major cities become progressively less habitable. Higher tides push saltwater further upstream, contaminating freshwater sources. Storm surges reach further inland, flooding areas that used to be safe. Groundwater tables rise, weakening foundations and causing buildings to settle unevenly. And mud. So much mud. As sea levels rise and storms intensify, sediment that used to be carried out to sea gets deposited in coastal areas instead. Harbours fill with silt. River channels become clogged. Street-level businesses find themselves dealing with regular flooding that deposits layers of mud every time the water recedes. Over decades or centuries, this could literally bury the lower levels of coastal cities. Not in a single catastrophic event, but through gradual, relentless accumulation. Look at Venice. The city is literally sinking as sea levels rise. First floors that were built at street level in the Renaissance are now basements. Buildings constructed centuries ago have their original entrances underwater. The city installs higher and higher flood barriers, builds elevated walkways, but the water keeps coming. Venice is slowly being buried, not by volcanic ash or earthquake rubble, but by the rising sea and the mud it carries. Now imagine that process accelerated and applied to every coastal city on Earth. New York, Shanghai, Mumbai, Lagos, Tokyo. Hundreds of cities housing billions of people, all facing the same slow drowning. They'll adapt for a while, building seawalls, elevating structures, installing pump systems. But there's a limit to how much adaptation is possible. Eventually, the cost of protecting these cities exceeds the economic benefit of maintaining them, and people leave. Not all at once in some dramatic evacuation, but gradually. The poorest residents first, then middle class, finally the wealthy when it becomes clear the situation is unrecoverable. The abandoned buildings fill with mud. Streets become canals, then marshes, then eventually just flat sediment plains with the tops of skyscrapers jutting out like strange monuments to a lost civilization, exactly like those cities in mud flood mythology. Buildings buried to their second or third stories, first floors full of sediment, evidence of advanced construction techniques preserved under layers of accumulated mud. This isn't speculation. It's the predictable result of processes already underway. We're watching it happen in real time, just slowly enough that we can pretend it's not really a catastrophe. But from the perspective of someone living 500 years from now, this period will look like a reset event. The time when coastal civilizations collapsed and humanity had to reorganize itself around new geographical realities. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we live knowing that resets happen, that civilizations fall, that everything we've built could be buried under mud or fried by solar storms or shaken apart by earthquakes we can't predict or prevent? One response is fatalism. Nothing matters because it's all going to collapse anyway, so why prepare? Why build? Why preserve knowledge or culture? That's certainly an option, but it's also how civilizations actually die. Not from the catastrophe itself, but from giving up before the catastrophe even arrives. The other response is to learn from the survivors, because remember, after every reset in human history, somebody survived. That genetic bottleneck 900,000 years ago, 1,280 people made it through. The Younger Dryas impact. Enough humans survived to repopulate entire continents. Every flood myth, every reset story, every tale of civilization collapse ends the same way. Some people make it through, and those survivors had certain things in common. They preserved knowledge. They maintained skills that could be practiced without complex technology. They built networks of cooperation that could survive stress and disruption. They stayed adaptable. They didn't assume the world would always work the way it had in the past. Most importantly, they took the threat seriously without letting it paralyze them. This is what those ancient reset myths are really telling us. Not everything is doomed, but catastrophes happen and humans figure out how to survive them. The stories aren't warnings to give up. They're instructions for getting through, and the instructions are surprisingly practical. Preserve knowledge in forms that don't require electricity or complex technology to access. This is why books still matter, why libraries are critical infrastructure, not just entertainment. Digital storage is convenient, but it's also fragile. One strong solar storm and every hard drive on Earth could be wiped. But books, especially books printed on acid-free paper and stored properly, can last thousands of years. Knowledge encoded in physical formats survives when everything else fails. Maintain practical skills, the ability to grow food, purify water, build shelter, provide basic medicine. Not because we're all going to become subsistence farmers, but because in any reset scenario, the people who survive are the ones who can meet basic needs without relying on intact supply chains and functioning technology. You don't need to be a prepper living in a bunker. You just need to know how to do useful things with your hands. Build real communities, not just online networks, but actual relationships with people who live near you. People you could rely on, and who could rely on you if systems failed. Because every survivor story, ancient or modern, involves cooperation. Isolated individuals don't make it. Groups with strong social bonds do, and perhaps most importantly hold both realities in your mind simultaneously. Yes, catastrophes happen. Yes, resets are possible, maybe even likely within the next few centuries, but also life continues. Civilizations recover. Knowledge gets preserved and transmitted. Humanity persists. This isn't about living in fear. It's about living with awareness. Understanding that the stability we experience now is temporary, like all stability throughout history. But also understanding that temporary doesn't mean meaningless. The fact that something won't last forever doesn't make it less valuable. It makes it more precious. Those ancient builders whose cities got buried under mud, they didn't know their work would be forgotten. They built anyway. They created beauty and meaning anyway. They preserved knowledge and passed it on to their children anyway. And because they did, some of that knowledge survived. Some of those buildings were eventually rediscovered. Their civilizations didn't achieve immortality, but they achieved something almost as important. They mattered. They contributed to the long story of human achievement that continues through resets and collapses and catastrophes of every kind. We're part of that same story, building on foundations laid by survivors of catastrophes we can't imagine, creating things that might someday be buried under mud or burned by solar storms or washed away by rising seas, but also creating knowledge and beauty and meaning that might just possibly survive. That might be discovered by future humans trying to understand where they came from and how their ancestors made it through the resets that nearly ended everything. This is the real lesson from mudflood myths and reset stories and all these ancient tales of civilization collapse. We're not immune. We're not special. We're not the first humans to build something impressive and assume it would last forever. But we're also part of something larger than any single civilization. Part of a species that has survived every catastrophe thrown at it for nearly 1 million years. Part of a story that continues through resets because enough people every time refuse to let the knowledge die completely. So preserve what matters. Build what you can. Connect with others. Stay adaptable. take the threats seriously, and then live anyway. Because that's what survivors do, not because they're guaranteed success, but because the alternative is giving up before the story ends, and humans, tested through bottlenecks and ice ages and floods and impacts and collapses beyond counting, are remarkably bad at giving up. The next reset will come, maybe in our lifetimes, maybe in our grandchildren's, maybe not for centuries, but it will come, and when it does, someone will survive. Someone will preserve knowledge. Someone will rebuild, just like always, just like every time before. That's not optimism. That's just history. The only history that matters when you're trying to decide how to live in a world where resets are real and catastrophes are cyclical and everything you build might someday be buried under mud. You live like it matters anyway, because it does, not forever, but for now. And now is all any civilization has ever had. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the mud and the myths, the buried cities and the flood stories that span every continent, every culture, every ancient tradition. You've travelled with us from the half-buried buildings of cities across the globe to the universal tales of catastrophic resets. From geological evidence that challenges comfortable timelines to cultural memories that refuse to fade no matter how many centuries pass. And if you're still awake, which honestly would be fine but also kind of defeats the purpose, you might be wondering what it all means. What can we actually conclude about the mud that buried civilizations? Here's the thing. We've explored 3 distinct threads tonight. First, the physical evidence. Cities that appear sunk into the ground, first floors that became basements, architectural features that make no sense unless something, whether sediment accumulation, volcanic ash, organic decomposition, or something more catastrophic, raised ground levels dramatically over relatively short periods. That evidence is real. You can see it with your own eyes in cities around the world. The question isn't whether it happened. The question is how and when and why. Second, the universal flood myths. Stories from cultures that had no contact with each other, all describing massive inundations, divine resets, civilizations destroyed by rising waters. From Mesopotamian tablets to Native American oral traditions, from Hindu texts to Pacific Islander legends, the pattern repeats with striking consistency. That consistency demands explanation. Whether it's cultural memory of actual catastrophes, psychological archetypes emerging independently, or something else entirely, the pattern is undeniable. Third, the geological and archaeological evidence of actual catastrophes. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, massive volcanic eruptions like Toba and Thera, the biblical scale flooding of the Black Sea, tsunami deposits in coastal regions worldwide. We know catastrophes happened. We know they were devastating enough to leave marks in both the geological record and human memory. What we're still debating is the scale, the timing, and whether they were significant enough to constitute true civilizational resets. The conventional interpretation, the one accepted by mainstream geology and archaeology, explains most of what we've discussed tonight through well-understood processes. Sediment accumulation, sea level changes, volcanic events, localized floods, all occurring over time frames that make sense within established chronologies. This interpretation has the weight of scientific consensus behind it, the accumulated evidence of thousands of researchers working across multiple disciplines. The alternative interpretation, the one that speaks of mudflows and resets and lost high civilizations, asks us to question whether those established chronologies might be incomplete, whether conventional explanations adequately account for all the evidence, whether there might be chapters of human history that have been literally buried and forgotten. This interpretation has the appeal of mystery, the satisfaction of questioning authority, the allure of hidden knowledge. Both approaches have value. The conventional view provides testable hypotheses, rigorous methodology, peer-reviewed research that builds incrementally on established knowledge. The alternative view asks uncomfortable questions, points out anomalies, refuses to accept explanations that don't quite satisfy. Science advances through both processes, through careful accumulation of evidence and through challenges to existing paradigms. What we can know with certainty is limited but significant. We know catastrophes have shaped human history. We know ground levels have risen in cities worldwide. We know flood myths are nearly universal. We know there are still mysteries in the archaeological record, sites that predate accepted timelines, technologies that seem too advanced for their supposed context, cultural connections that span impossible distances. What remains speculation is the interpretation. Were these isolated events or coordinated catastrophes, natural processes or something more dramatic, gradual accumulation or sudden inundation? The mud doesn't tell us everything. It preserves evidence but not always context. The myths preserve memory but not always accuracy. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the value isn't in reaching definitive conclusions, but in asking the questions, in looking at familiar landscapes with fresh eyes and wondering what lies beneath, in listening to ancient stories and considering what truths they might preserve, in respecting scientific method while remaining open to the possibility that our current understanding is incomplete. Because history's mysteries aren't problems to be solved before you can rest. They're companions for the journey into sleep, questions that don't demand immediate answers, puzzles that can occupy your mind gently as consciousness fades. The mud that buried civilizations isn't threatening. It's an invitation to wonder, to imagine, to drift into dreams of lost worlds and forgotten catastrophes and the resilience of human memory across unimaginable spans of time. So if you've enjoyed this exploration into the mysteries beneath our feet and the myths that span our world, consider leaving a like. Drop a comment letting us know where you're listening from, maybe while lying in bed with the lights off, maybe driving through the night, maybe just needing voices to fill the silence. Subscribe for more journeys through history's strangest corners, the questions that don't have easy answers, the stories that help you rest. And now let the mysteries settle around you like sediment, layer upon layer, burying the urgent thoughts of the day under the weight of deep time and ancient catastrophes, and the comforting knowledge that civilizations have ended before and begun again, that the world has been reset and survived, that beneath every city lies evidence of everything that came before, waiting patiently in the mud for someone to remember. Sleep well with history's mysteries.